today's guest, Sarah Brown, VP Marketing at Sastrify.
I think what you're getting at is the importance of company values. So really instilling in your team this value around proactive communication, both sort of receiving it and sort of proactively seeking it, but also proactively sharing it. And I do agree with you. I think that's a huge challenge as your org gets bigger, because especially, you can fit the entire company, let's say in a Zoom meeting or in a conference room, right? You sort of walk over or just have one meeting for everyone. But to your point, when you have more and more complexity, you sort of have that breakdown. And I think, again, it goes back to values for me, and something I think a lot of companies struggle with. I've certainly experienced this where, like, whose responsibility is it to find out something? If you have documentation and no one is looking at it, it doesn't matter. Someone's still chatting. Where's this thing? Or how do I find that? So I think really teaching ourselves to be sort of proactive in how we find information and also proactively sharing it. And then also, I think there's some level of you're never going to know all of the context. I think about this as a marketing leader, right? Within my first team, which is a concept from Patrick Lencioni, he wrote the 5 Dysfunctions of a Team and sort of has a lot of work in that field. The idea of your first team is really your executive team, your leadership team. And then your other team is your functional area. So VP of sales or, VP of operations, whatnot, then sort of. But I always have the most context on my leadership team of what's going on in marketing on any given day. And I also have the most context on what's going on in the leadership team, on the marketing team on any given day. So I'm constantly going up and down sharing context. And also there's some context you can't share in certain times where you just have to wait. So I think there also has to be a level of trust established. And for me, I have a high level of trust in my CEO and my co-founders where, as we're working through issues with the board or figuring out the market, I have to have trust and faith in that vision. And then it's my job on the marketing side to figure out how that looks in the world. But there has to be also a shared sort of commitment to embodying that mission. And when you also get to a certain company size, I think you find people have divergent views of where the company should go, and you have to create alignment there. And that's easier said than done. I'm really happy to talk more about this topic.
Sarah and I talked about her 2 books, Leading Upwards and Power to the Startup People. So she's from San Francisco and did a lot of go-to-market for mid-market, enterprise companies, and many more. And we talked a lot about leadership, especially across a certain stage, and how dynamic and temporary a role can be, and how important the expectations and also the right leadership style for the right environment is. And especially for the whole go-to-market suite across startups, scale-ups, and then also corporates. So I think everybody who's interested in that topic, it's a really insightful and episode, and we got very specific about the go-to-market function and different company stages. So enjoy.
Then you can build trust, and then you can spend less time communicating and more time just getting shit done.
Then I went home and thought about this sentence.
We basically put it on the table.
Hiring takes time. People are trained.
How to objectively judge certain situations.
It's very, 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 very hard to change things.
That was the learning.
Entrepreneurs with empathy.
To the people side.
Hi, Sarah. It's great that we have a chance to talk. Now, on my end, it's 7 p.m. And on your end, how late is it? You're in San Francisco, right?
Yes, it's 10 a.m. here. So really excited to chat with you today.
Perfect time. So, and also glad that we got to know each other, because I think the connection came from Anna Ott, who we both know, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Can you share more about the background there? How the connection came?
Absolutely. So I have the privilege of being the vice president of marketing at a fast-growing B2B SaaS company called Sastrify. We're the SaaS buying and management platform, and we are invested in by HV Capital, which is where Anna Ott works. So gotten to be a fan of her work through HV, and I know many, many, many listeners are fans of her work as well. So very cool. And thank you, Anna, for the connection.
Yes, thanks, Anna. Shout out to Anna. So maybe you can give us a bit more context about yourself. This is how I usually like to start. And I think you have a very interesting background and also a cool specialization, which we can also maybe deep dive a bit later on.
Absolutely. So my background is in B2B SaaS, and particularly on the go-to-market side. And as I kind of grew in my marketing career and got sort of more and more leadership roles and eventually became a part of the executive team, I, on a personal level, noticed that there was a real gap in education, content, resources for startup employees. And through my work mentoring at Techstars, which is an accelerator for early stage companies, and also through my work in the Colorado startup ecosystem in the US, I got to really see the importance for founders of hiring really high quality executives, but also being able to develop their in-house talent to enable them to be successful at the leadership level. And as I was out there looking at content resources to help me on my journey, I realized there wasn't much. And so I have had the benefit of coaches, of CEOs who believed in me. I had an executive coach when preparing for my first exec role, but the 2 books I've written, Power to the Startup People, and the newest book, Lead Upwards, have really focused on books I wish had existed and include interviews with experts, people from the ecosystem, founders, VCs, startup executives on how to be successful. And it's been a really enriching side gig, I will say, from a just personal gratification perspective, to be able to have these conversations and talk to people like you, even outside of my day job, which I also love in growing SaaS companies.
Sarah, first of all, really appreciate it that we got to talk to each other, because I think that's something what I'm always look for. Passionate people about a certain topic that is somehow connected to leadership, management, or certain aspects of it. And before we go a bit deeper in the books you wrote about, and maybe also a bit of how a B2B marketing org can look like, I think that's also quite interesting, because it changes over time and depending on companies' products and also customers, it varies. But what shaped you most that you got so passionate about the leadership topics?
I think it was actually hanging out with really amazing founders. Maybe an odd answer, but I'll explain. So I spent a lot of time with founders and thinking about how to build a company. You really have to be on the marketing side, very close to the CEO, close to the founders. And for me, I always choose a role that I'm going to sort of spend my blood, sweat, and tears, building a company if I truly believe in the founders, and usually co-founders. And I always look for a strong co-founder relationship. That's really crucial, something we have definitely at Sastrify. But that's been true of previous companies. And I've tended to see that the companies that do well really have that strong relationship between the founders. But anyway, as I've built those relationships with founders, I've kind of started digesting their information diet of the books they're reading, the courses they're taking, what they're trying to learn. I saw this at Techstars with how founders were approaching their people challenges and problems. And I started to feel just underrepresented from the employee side. I thought, well, everything that the founders are going through, employees have a different perspective on. And if you think about it, a founder may be at a company for 10, 15 years, depending on how long it takes, if they're successful, to have an exit or to take the company to the next stage of growth, like going public, whatever that outcome may be, or landing the plane and selling it. And employees may have many, many jobs within that time frame. So I found this I like to think of it as a healthy irritation of like, why is no one talking about this? Or why aren't enough people talking about it? And then from a leadership perspective, as a member of multiple underrepresented groups, I felt also it was odd getting to the leadership level that tended to be a few people who looked like me. And I didn't think that was based on necessarily merit. It was more that I think a lot of folks from underrepresented backgrounds may or may not see themselves represented. And so my work has always attempted to be, it's a work in progress, inclusive of everyone. So no matter what your background, you can potentially see yourself if you're interested in a path to leadership, whereas many people may or may not ever want to be startup leaders. They may be really happy as individual contributors, and that's really valid too. But I'm happy to dig more into that as well.
Yes, and I think the temporary aspect of a role along the growth journey of a company is something what a lot of maybe also first-time founders or first-time leaders or overall first-timers in an environment that is predetermined to change fast and develop. I think it's really important to set the expectation in the hiring process already, what the environment will look like if some people are not used to it already or don't know what to expect, because otherwise later on you have a lot of tension when you need to change certain, I would say, behavior of teams or structures. And you could even say, okay, in a startup everything is dynamic, but it can be not. Especially if expectations are not managed right or managed at all or defined, responsibility is not defined and so on. And how how do you think you can enable an organization that also a good balance of maybe leaders from within can be grown, and also a certain level of experience can be hired externally into it? How would you approach that overall, or what are your thoughts towards that topic? Maybe it's a bit of a broad question, but I asked it broad because you wrote so much about it.
Sure. I love this question. Maybe I'll start by taking the approach of the other side, which is how can startup employees think about, will I be hired for a role that maybe I will reach a certain limit at the company and someone will be hired over me? And am I okay with that? Or potentially, is there room for me to grow and sort of develop in my career? And then also I can talk about how companies can think about it. So something that we tend to see at the earliest stage companies is everyone's doing everything, right? I mean, even the CEO is fielding all the sales calls, and somehow they're, managing accounting and all of this. And as you grow and become more mature, you hire more specialists, and that's just the natural evolution. And you still have some generalists within organizations, but the idea is the maturity is you have people who are very competent in certain areas, very experienced, or are growing that experience. And something we also see in different funding environments, you need a certain level of growth within a certain time period where just mathematically you can't necessarily get that growth from a people perspective within that time. So for instance, if you raise, let's say a Series A, and you have a certain revenue milestone to get to by the end of the year, you might need to hire a salesperson who you can guarantee will sort of have that background versus training an SDR to sort of be the AE. I mean, that's a very simplified example, but I also think within our current fundraising environment, we're seeing that companies need to make capital last longer and extend their runways, which can be a really good thing for employee growth because you might have more time to hit certain revenue milestones or company milestones, and there may be more opportunities to grow. So from a broad perspective, I would say the landscape may or may not offer that to the same degree that it did in the past, where in the past it really was, okay, fundraising round, we need to sort of level up higher. I hate the expression, but sort of adults in the room. But from an employee perspective, if you think about it, you could be hired as the only marketer. And then suddenly your company grows and reaches a certain level of maturity. Now you really need someone who can lead a team. And if you don't have that experience, there may or may not be room for you to do that. And so what I've seen work really well, I'll just give this advice to employees and sort of my fellow employees, is think about what's really important to you in your career. And don't underestimate the power of working for someone who may or may not be a really good leader and mentor for you. And if you're only focused on sort of getting to the next rung, you can really lose that really valuable chance to get that leadership, coaching, training, just even by watching how they perform and how they manage. That being said, especially if you're sort of on the cusp, let's say you're the head of the marketing department, and you really want to be the VP, or you really want to be the CMO, you can have a conversation with your founders and say, what are your expectations? Where's the gap between where I'm performing now and what you would need from a board perspective, from a leadership perspective? And then potentially you can ask not to be hired over. You can have a conversation where you're saying, look, I see this gap. I'm going to get coaching. I'm going to listen to the people factor. I'm going to read Lead Upwards, and I'm going to get the skills I need. That being said, sometimes the reality is we're going to need someone potentially who has the experience. They've already seen the playbook. And that's also, I would say, on the kind of company side, a risk where if you're hiring someone from outside, the risk is if they've come from a big company, they might not understand your startup. They certainly don't have experience with your culture versus the person who's maybe come up and sort of seen it through the years. That being said, if you hire from internally, especially if you're hiring, let's say, a VP of sales, let's say you promote your head of sales, they may or may not have a good reputation in the market where, VP of sales comes on board. One of their first remits is go hire a bunch of AEs that you've worked with in the past, or SDRs you've worked with in the past. So they don't have that network to pull from. Also, a lot of people are skeptical of reporting to a first-time leader. It'd be kind of nerve-wracking. Like, is this person going to actually be a good boss for me? So it's very complicated. There's trade-offs. I read about it a lot in Lead Upwards. But I will say, I think from my experience, there's often a lot of opportunity in early stage companies if you're patient and if you're proactive in talking to your founders and talking to your leadership team about what your goals are, where you could say, look, maybe I'm going to be hired over for the CMO role or for the CRO role, but I'd like to develop in these other ways. And can I continue focusing on that? And I would also say it's individual. A lot of people are really happy going from being the only marketer to suddenly they have a team of 10 or 20 and they get to play a different role as a specialist. So How's that? I'm curious how you approach that too, Thomas. I know you talk about it a lot with companies you work with.
In case you like my show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. So I would categorize it in different stages. Let's say a classical, seed stage marketing or a sales team or go-to-market unit can also really vary depending on how the founders see themselves in terms of expertise and also motivation on what they want to do. And I would always recommend for the founders, especially in the beginning, really do the sales by yourself, because there is not much I think you can offer initially beside the founder's charisma, trust, and everything he or she has in their minds to convince with passion and later on getting it delivered and prioritized, right? So I think that's key in the beginning. And I think the whole marketing aspect is sometimes maybe following that approach, because once you have a message market fit or a product market fit, you can invest further in a marketing approach. But I think first you can see it under product, under marketing, under sales. I don't mind. Yeah, I think it's really go to market, but depending on what the setup is, it's more maybe a product-based approach, a marketing-based approach, or a sales-based approach. So there it really varies, and I would always hire in the beginning generalists with a lot of potential. Yeah. Later on, when you see certain patterns and certain structures getting more recurring, try to get somebody who either wants to specialize or hire specialists. And I think in the beginning, Series A, you don't need leaders with big management experiences in scope. Maybe one by department, but also maybe one or two previous roles in experience is maybe good enough. Yeah. I think if you're coming to expansion in terms of several, also multi-product, multi-market, fast delivery, you need to hire people who have been there, done that. And then usually also the founders cannot excel with a certain speed. And then you need to make the first 300K hires. Yeah. Maybe earlier on, you need to make the first 150K hires in terms of, let's say, gross annual salary. And there you also can expect that they are still partly hands-on. But I think from a 300K hire, don't expect to be too hands-on. Just give them the full responsibility, measure them on targets, let them set the targets, and let them deliver what they need to, and set the expectations on what's the time they need and the resources they need to deliver, and provide them. And of course, always do your due diligence. But I think that's 3 stages on how I see hiring in an evolving journey. And what is happening in between on the second layer, I would say, really depends on the people you set on top, and also on the environment, right? If it's a B2B SaaS product that is more for the enterprise segment, or maybe in the beginning you cannot even sell to enterprise, because why should they talk to a company that does not have a proper position in the market? Yeah, it's tough. So maybe you start with mid-market or SMBs and then go up market during the time you have more traction, the time you have a better product market fit. And this is always possible at some point, I guess, but you also then need to really try and focus hard, because the whole go-to-market for enterprise in each vertical, in each market, needs to be highly a prioritized and focused approach. And if you don't get the teams focused on maybe 5 to 25 accounts per year to target, you will fail.
Yeah. It's interesting. You're covering a lot of different areas here. I think are probably really valuable for people listening. And I would say for startup employees who are thinking, well, how does this impact me? How do I think about my journey? The reality is you kind of have to reassess your career every 6 months, maybe even more, but at least every 6 months. And I think particularly at milestones like fundraising, you'll come in at a seed stage potentially, and the company looks very, very different, sometimes even just 6 months or a year later, depending on the maturity, depending on growth. And I think that can really catch people off guard. I'll also say, you made a point about setting targets, and when you're hiring these sort of experienced leaders, we've all had a leader come in and they haven't touched, a CRM in forever, and they just only know how to read a report, and they haven't necessarily been in the weeds, or I like to call it on the shop floor. And I think it's really crucial, especially, at certain startup stages like Series A, Series B, where you have that leader who maybe has that deep expertise of where you're trying to go, like trying to get to that 50 million in ARR. But until you get to that sort of next benchmark or milestone, they do need to be fairly hands-on in some ways. Not that they're executing, but they need to at least understand. And I think one thing that big company people I've talked to really struggle with coming to smaller startups is they may have this very specific set of knowledge that works with a ton of resources, but we all have to be creative in startups, particularly now. I would also say a lot of folks who are going from startups to kind of getting into larger companies, they have to learn how to take true ownership and really ownership at the business levels that the board is interested in, that shareholders are interested in. And so I think scaling is quite hard in both directions. It's hard to come up when you've been the person who does everything. And it's hard to come from, I have a huge team and an assistant, and then suddenly I'm, wow, everything's broken. And why isn't that person a role yet, right? You have to kind of figure out how to make that work. But yeah, I love this topic, and I'm glad that you think about it, and certainly rich one to dig into more.
To be honest, and I think also not every organization needs these type of hires at all sometimes, yeah? Sometimes you can, if you have a very, I would say, lean approach or structure, or the founders want to grow into that role, it can still work out. I think a great example is Zalando, not yet anymore, but they really grew founder-led to a very, very late stage, and still the founders running the company. But of course, they hired a CTO like from Amazon, who then ran the show for some time. I think he's not there anymore. But this is, I would say, a prime example for, a scale-up or a startup or now a public company, a major corporate that is quite new or fresh-born still, hires than somebody from an Amazon, which is also maybe not that old, but way bigger in scale. It can also maybe just work for a certain period of time where you need that, and at some point it doesn't fit anymore, right? So I think this needs to be seen very individual and very temporary. But I think the key is there to always define the expectations with help of others, benchmark your expectations, iterate your expectations, and also be very transparent towards the candidates, and also being open to let them shape the expectations based on their individual experience, that it can work out. And there are so many aspects to it: the existing team, the legacy of the company and the team, the future, I would say, prospective market environments. So many things to consider. So I think you cannot give a general answer to it. You need to really discuss it case by case, because it's hyper individual. And I see when I make a lot of VP or director hires, or even managing director hires, I always, in the first step, listen to what is expected, and then do not question it too much before I talk to 5 to 10 candidates from different scopes, and then go back and say, that's the feedback from that type of person, and that type of person. What do you want to do with it? Because we need to do something with it, but the question is what? And then it really defines the style on what you hire, and also shapes the next stage of the company, and also the role you define. So I think that should be a very iterative approach, and I think you need to be open-minded enough for that, and be able to give away control and power to get to the right conclusion and decision at some point. And maybe you can tell us how to lead upwards.
I have to say, titling a book is not for the faint of heart. It's a challenge. You have to figure out sort of what your audience is going to resonate with. And I'm a marketer, right? So lead upwards. I think an alternate title for the book was potentially going to be The Nonlinear Path. And I think they're related. And the idea of leading upwards, I think a lot of us have this perspective that depending on what our title is, we sort of lead down from there, right? We're the leader. But actually, regardless of your title, you could be an individual contributor. There are ways to take ownership and create impact. And so what I wanted to reflect in the book as well is, for those who are not the founders, who are not the ones starting companies, we make a tremendous impact on the ecosystem. And, if every startup employee today sort of said, I'm done, I don't want to come to work tomorrow, right? The SaaS industry would be sort of up in arms. Everything would shut down. And we truly are the lifeblood of the industry. And if you think about how many founders there are for every employee just in the ecosystem, it's tremendous. And I think we tend to have this belief that we are, because we're not the founders, because we're not the ones who are establishing the companies, that we can't lead in the same way. And so what I really wanted to highlight was if you're a joiner, this is a term coined by a VC named Jeff Busgang, who was generous in contributing to the book. He runs Flybridge Capital, VC at Flybridge Capital. He's also a Harvard business professor. But what I appreciate about Jeff's concept of the joiner is this person who is motivated, wants to contribute, is joining the company, really buying into the founder's mission. And so I think to lead upwards, sort of think about this career perspective of, regardless of my title, what's the impact I want to make? Where do I want to grow? How can I make sure that's right for me and not what I see this other person doing? And I think that's what I'm supposed to do. So I encourage people, and I offer guidance in the book to really individualize. And we talk a lot in the book about company fit as well as stage fit. And I think it's really important to do a lot of self-inquiry and self-awareness and saying, not just what am I good at, but what I actually want to do. And I talk about as well people who kind of get into this place where they're really good at something. Maybe you're a fantastic customer marketer. You're really good at doing all of those deep interviews, but maybe you're an introvert and you don't want to get on a plane every week or a train every week, right? So you have to really know yourself. I think it's important too to look around and say, I don't really want to work for a 500-person company. I'd really rather be one of those first 15 people sitting around or standing in a parking lot, right? Like the early days at Netflix. And I think you have to really know too, if you want to go back to that stage, or if you are open to the ride and the journey. And having joined companies at seed stage and taken them through Series B, through exit, I've worked for a public company after it acquired one of my companies I was working with. I mean, I've seen a lot of different stages, and wow, they feel different, like really remarkably different. The level of process, whether you know everyone's name, how much you're actually involved in things on other teams, something at early stage. I mean, everyone gets to have a say on what the product is building. It's kind of amazing. You actually know maybe not how many story points something is that engineering's working on, but you really understand your teammates. And then as the company gets bigger, you sort of have less and less visibility. So I think it's important to kind of ask yourself, is this what I want? Do I want to learn how to be someone who can be at a 500 or 1,000 person or a 10,000 person company? Or do I really want to stay for this part of the journey?
I think also one tip I would add there, and I totally agree with everything, and I would always say, yeah, that's super smart, but it's hard to figure that out. Because how did you figure that out? Yeah, if you're busy working all the time, and that's usually the case, people, especially first time in a role and so on, you can get overwhelmed. Yeah, getting a psychologist or a coach really helps. Yeah, you can call it however you want, but I think that's something what really, really adds a lot of value, and it costs some money. But I think if you do it proactively without having a certain area where you really want to dive into, this can already be enough. And you just go once a month to just reflect and have somebody really neutral and keeping you a bit of accountable at some point if you switch patterns or if you're turning it in circles. And then also mapping out a bit the expectations of yourself, what you actually want to achieve. Plus also another side, which I would differentiate, is mentoring. And mentoring for me is a bit more specific to a certain topic or area or environment. And I think the whole coaching and psychology part would be quite neutral to the topic, which can go personal, professional, health related, whatever it is. Yeah. And doing this just maybe every 18 to 24 months, I think can always help proactively. What do you think about that topic?
I love that coaching, mentoring. I think those are really crucial. I also think, it's interesting. It can be hard to know. Am I unhappy because my company just got really big? Am I unhappy because I'm working on something I don't like? Am I unhappy because it's just a stressful month in my life and maybe I'm going through something on the personal side and I don't know whether work is part of that. And I think we tend to have a belief of the grass is greener, like, oh, other companies, but it's funny, like some of the challenges I think we face at growing companies, I try to normalize it on teams, which is every growing company faces this. And this is kind of weird, but I think right between a Series A and a Series B, like right when you're about to raise your Series B, I've noticed a slump at every single company I've been at for like a couple weeks. Just, it's scary. It's a huge jump in terms of the next scale of growth. And I've just seen the culture break down at literally every company I've been at that's done that round. And then it goes back up. And I don't know why, but I'll just note it. And so I think also when you do have experienced people in the room, maybe potentially a founder hasn't been through a certain fundraising stage, or maybe they have, but it's helpful just to be able to also talk to a coach, to your point. And your coach is like, yeah, that's normal. Whatever you're going through. First board meeting, it was painful. No worries. They're always painful the first time, or maybe the first 300 times, who knows? But I think it's also really helpful to get out of your own head and say, oh, I'm not unique. This is actually just a really challenging moment, or, this churn potential that happens after you reach a certain set of scale, right? Because you've had the luxury of having a lot of customers, and some of them maybe weren't a good fit. Maybe you had people come on board and you got them outside of your ICP. Then you really honed your ICP. Well, natural churn, right? You have companies that weren't really a good fit for you in the first place. So I think some of that too is, as a leader or as someone, kind of helping your team, you can say, actually, this is normal. And some of that's to be expected.
In case you have any feedback or anything you want to share with me, please send me an email on thomas@peoplewise.com or hit me up on LinkedIn. And in case you really enjoy the show, please subscribe. I would really appreciate it. I think the Series A and Series B cultural change aspect, I think there is a pattern what I identified. So usually when you get Series B, the founders are way more detached from the teams, because there is usually a layer of middle management throughout the company. And I think to just build this layer of middle management, or even if it's not there yet, but you have to do that, I think the expectations or the behavior changes without the implementation being done yet. And this is where usually things clash. Oh, it can also it also can happen later, depending on if they did a seed, pre-seed, or whatever when they start, and how mature the company is with it. But I think this starts when you go either multi-product or multi-markets. Because at some point you need to have a certain way of maybe matrix org, where you get a hierarchical structure in G&A orgs. Maybe you already get started with kind of a matrix org in the whole revenue field, because you need to divide by products or divide by countries. And especially if you're talking about SaaS world, in the product development side, you usually always get a kind of a matrix org, or a different type of org that is not hierarchical, because you work in different cross-functional teams. Yeah,
like
and
pods. Yeah,
this is really changing, I think, the whole way people interact, work together. Communication is a big aspect, because suddenly it gets so complex, where you usually pass the 80 to 120 people mark, where you actually would maybe also need all hands, not just for the company, but each team or each group, each layer that has a certain amount of people also needs an all hands, and also then needs to interact with the other organizations that have interdependencies. And there you usually also see it in the prioritization, that suddenly nobody knows what's the prioritization. Everybody's doing too much, because it's completely a new complexity and way more dependencies that you cannot map. And until this is settled in, it takes, as you said, maybe even half a year or 9 months. And then the Series C is coming. No, it was a different environment, but sometimes it happens.
Yeah. Well, I think what you're getting at is the importance of company values. So really instilling in your team this value around proactive communication, both sort of receiving it and sort of proactively seeking it, but also proactively sharing it. And I do agree with you. I think that's a huge challenge as your org gets bigger, because especially, you can fit the entire company, let's say in a Zoom meeting or in a conference room, right? You sort of walk over or just have one meeting for everyone. But to your point, when you have more and more complexity, you sort of have that breakdown. And I think, again, it goes back to values for me, and something I think a lot of companies struggle with. I've certainly experienced this, where like, whose responsibility is it to find out something? If you have documentation and no one is looking at it, it doesn't matter. Someone's still chatting. Where's this thing? Or how do I find that? So I think really teaching ourselves to be sort of proactive in how we find information, and also proactively sharing it. And then also, I think there's some level of you're never going to know all of the context. I think about this as a marketing leader, right? Within my first team, which is a concept from Patrick Lencioni, he wrote the 5 dysfunctions of a team and sort of has a lot of work in that field. The idea of your first team is really your executive team, your leadership team. And then your other team is your functional area. So VP of sales, or, VP of operations, whatnot, then sort of. But I always have the most context on my leadership team of what's going on in marketing on any given day. And I also have the most context on what's going on the leadership team, on the marketing team on any given day. So I'm constantly going up and down sharing context. And also there's some context you can't share in certain times where you just have to wait. So I think there also has to be a level of trust established. And for me, I have a high level of trust in my CEO and my co-founders where, as we're working through issues with the board or figuring out the market, I have to have trust and faith in that vision. And then it's my job on the marketing side to figure out how that looks in the world. But there has to be also a shared sort of commitment to embodying that mission. And when you also get to a certain company size, I think you find people have divergent views of where the company should go, and you have to create alignment there. And that's easier said than done. I'm really happy to talk more about this topic.
Yeah, no, definitely agree. I think we're just a bit over time because I try to always keep it at 30 minutes. So maybe we wrap it up here. Is there anyone you can recommend who I interview next, which I don't know yet?
Sure. I'm very biased here, but I think you should talk to Sven Lackinger. He's our CEO, co-founder of Sastrify. He's one of the more, I think, visionary founders in terms of people leadership. And, he and his co-founder, Max, have really put a lot of thought into how we structure our people team and empowering the people team that we have. We have a fantastic people team at Sastrify.
Yeah, if he would be open to that, I would definitely love to do that.
Yeah, I'm happy to see. I might know someone who knows him. We'll see. Happy to talk. But this has been a pleasure, Thomas. I could talk to you all day, and I just love to. One thing I'll note for your listeners is, if you're interested in learning about these topics and talking about them, my DMs are open on LinkedIn. Always happy to chat and have conversations on the show notes. I think we need to be having more conversations like this because it can feel very lonely and isolating in the startup world. We think our unique company, it's so special, but ultimately we're all in this ecosystem together and genuinely believe we're all here to help each other. So I love that you take that approach to helping companies. And I'm excited to meet people who also believe in that.
Cool. Yeah, I would have maybe an intro. A colleague of mine, Alex, he is doing a GTM, as a go-to-market podcast, and it's called Go-to-Market Mastery. When we now record, it's not launched yet, but when the episode will be live, I think already 4 or 5 episodes will be out. The VP sales of Personio and so on is interviewed, and a lot of other folks, and it's really around go-to-market. And I think if you're open to that, it would be super interesting, and I would forward to listen to it.
Sure. Oh, thank you. Likewise. Yeah, I would love that. Thank you so much.
Thank you as well.